February 9th, 1902, Halford's Reach, Maine, late afternoon. The shutter snapped open with a click that echoed softly against the soot-blackened stone of the Werrin Textile Mill. Edwin Crowthall adjusted the lens hood and stepped back, his breath forming slow, white plumes in the brittle air. Snow lined the crevices of the cobblestone courtyard behind the mill, though no fresh flakes had fallen in days. The building loomed like a dead colossus, its windows smeared with grime, its walls cracked like old knuckles. A single arch framed the north wall, the crumbling keystone discolored by years of oil smoke and weather rot. He exhaled and reached for the second plate. Milo Penn, his young assistant, held the tripod steady. He glanced at the sky, gray and unspeaking. The carbide lamp they'd used to illuminate the first exposure sat dim on the ground, its fuel nearly spent. Edwin frowned, carefully sliding the glass plate into the chamber. The work was routine. 3 angles for record purposes: north arch, central yard, west corner. The mill owners wanted documentation for insurance. Half the town whispered the Werrin brothers planned to sell the factory by spring. But as Edwin positioned the camera again, something shifted in the light. There was no wind, no sound, but the air pressed tighter, as if the world itself inhaled and forgot to let go. Milo blinked. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Edwin nodded without speaking. He just locked the second plate into place when a low, resonant tone trembled through the courtyard, a single humming note, like a cello string struck somewhere beneath the stone. It passed through them without breeze or echo. Milo swore under his breath. Edwin lifted his hand to activate the flash hood. The sound vanished. The shutter clacked again. When the third exposure was made moments later, Edwin's hands shook enough to drop the charred remains of the flash casing. Milo retrieved it in silence, noticing the metal still warm despite the cold. They packed the gear and left without speaking much. It wasn't until that evening, in Edwin's darkroom above Miller Street, that the trouble began. The first plate showed what it should: the archway, snow-dusted bricks, the oil drum to the right. The second plate, however, made Edwin pause. Beneath the arch, right where nothing had stood, was a shadow. It was shaped like a man. Not just a blur or exposure streak, but a full silhouette, bent forward slightly, as though in prayer or mourning. The arms folded together, the legs spaced apart. No source above it, no figure beside it, just the shadow, cast cleanly across the stones like a body's echo without the body. Edwin held the plate to the lamplight, examining the grain. No scratches, no warp, no double exposure artifacts. Milo leaned in, peering over his shoulder. "Was someone there?" he whispered. "No." Edwin's voice came tight. "I made sure." You saw Milo didn't answer. He was staring at Edwin's reflection in the glass. But for a flicker of a moment he swore there were 2 shadows behind him, his own, and another, hovering just a few inches closer to the plate. The third plate showed the same courtyard, but the shadow had moved. It had shifted westward by perhaps 2 feet. Still no figure casting it. Still no object overhead. And that's when the smell hit them. It was faint, not chemical, not the usual developer scent, but something metallic, like the air after lightning. Ozone. The temperature in the room seemed to dip. Edwin backed away, glass in hand, and placed it gently on the table. He didn't speak. Milo did, his voice barely audible. "We shouldn't show these." The next morning, Edwin wrapped the plates in linen, boxed them beneath his travel trunk, and locked it with a rusted clasp. He told no one, not the insurance clerk, not the Werrins, not even Milo again. When he left Halford's Reach a week later, the trunk went with him. It would remain unopened until 1936, when he died alone in a boarding house in Ellensburg. The trunk was part of his estate inventory. Inside, the 3 plates were intact, though the wrapping cloth was strangely damp, despite the trunk being dry. No one could explain it. In 1938, Helen Maris, a local archivist, rediscovered the negatives while cataloging early industrial photographs for the Brimwell County Historical Annex. She didn't notice anything unusual until she looked at Plate 2 under magnification. "What is this?" she asked aloud in the silence of the archive room. She adjusted the loop. The silhouette was sharp, haunting, perfectly shaped. A man bent forward, palms together like supplication, yet clearly unconnected to anything physical. She labeled it unverified anomaly. Later that night, in her personal notebook, she described it differently. A stain that refuses to belong to anything. The plate was sealed in a climate-controlled drawer beneath the annex vault, alongside dozens of other factory records, old mill invoices, and glass negatives of little consequence. Most forgot it, until 1971. That was when the humidity control failed, just briefly, just enough to trigger the alarm. When a technician entered the vault at 3:17 a.m., he noticed moisture running down the locked case containing Plate 2. Only that one. Inside, the glass had shifted. Half an inch. No external force, no open cabinet. And when he stepped closer, the light flickered, and the shadow did not stay on the glass. It appeared, just for a moment, on the concrete wall beside him. And then it was gone. The technician would never enter that vault again. The glass was resealed, labeled, "Do not photograph again." That was when the shadow began to move. The photographer collapsed just after the third flash. It happened in the north yard of the Werrin Textile Mill, an open cobblestone courtyard bordered by soot-blackened walls and the sour tang of boiled flax in the air. A bitter February wind curled through the arches as Edwin Crowthall staggered backward from his camera, one hand pressed to his chest, the other grasping at nothing. Milo Penn, his teenage assistant, rushed forward, slipping slightly on the damp stone. "Mr. Crowthall," he called, voice cracking from cold and fear. The older man's face was pale, a sheen of sweat already forming beneath his cap despite the freezing air. "I heard." "A note," Edwin muttered, blinking fast. Just before the shutter fell. Like a cello. One stroke. Deep Milo steadied him, eyes flicking between his mentor's trembling hands and the camera that still stood upright on its brass legs. The third plate had been exposed, the flash powder had ignited, but something felt wrong. The air had gone quiet. No birds, no rustle of steam from the rooftop vents, just stillness and something else, something beneath the silence. Dr. Reuben Alcott was summoned to the mill's infirmary 10 minutes later. A practical man in his late 40s, Alcott had seen his share of accidents, needle punctures, belt lacerations, the black cough that choked men after a decade in the carding rooms. But what met him in the small shuttered office that served as a makeshift treatment room unnerved him. Edwin sat upright, alert but detached. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, though the curtains were drawn. "He's hearing something," Milo whispered as the doctor unpacked his satchel. "Said it hasn't stopped since the photograph." Alcott kneeled beside the cot and placed a hand on Edwin's wrist, checking the pulse. "What kind of sound?" he asked. Edwin blinked slowly. "Like breath. Being drawn in, not out. Constant from stone, I think. Or under it." Alcott met Milo's eyes briefly but said nothing. He felt the pulse again. Too fast, but steady. Later that night, the doctor began a draft entry in his personal ledger, a private section kept separate from the mill's official records. He titled it, "Exposure Incident, February 1902. His notes described the odd behavior, the physical symptoms, and the shared impression between both men that something had occurred outside of known experience. Yet before he could finish the page, there was a knock at his door. It was Cyril Werrin, the mill's reclusive owner, dressed in his usual heavy overcoat, boots still dusted with ice. "I'd like a word, Reuben," he said simply. Inside, Werrin refused tea and stood by the mantel with arms crossed. "You understand the need for discretion," he began. Mr. Crowthall's episode, whatever it was, must not be misinterpreted by our workforce. We've enough trouble with the spring orders behind schedule. It wasn't heat exhaustion, Alcott said flatly. I don't care what it was, Werrin replied. You'll keep it off the medical rolls. And if you're inclined to finish that little report you write for yourself each month, I'd rather it didn't include this. There was a pause. Werrin's fingers tapped against his sleeve. Privacy, Doctor. For his sake. For ours. Alcott stared at the half-written page long after the door shut behind the mill owner. His fountain pen hovered above the last word he'd written, contamine, but something in him faltered. He tore the sheet at an angle, folding the lower half into a neat square and placing it in a separate envelope. It smelled faintly of camphor oil from the drawer sachets. He sealed it with wax, labeled nothing, and buried it between old estate ledgers. That envelope wouldn't be seen again for over 30 years. When the Werrin estate was finally auctioned in 1938, 2 decades after Cyril's quiet death and the mill's closure, a young museum technician named Franklin Aves cataloged boxes for the Brimwell County Historical Annex. Among old instruments, chain samples, and payroll books, he found a shallow wooden crate lined in cracked oilcloth. Inside were 3 glass plate negatives and the folded scrap of paper, its ink faded but legible. Do not print until the sound stops. Aves brought the note to his supervisor, expecting some logical explanation, a joke, a misfiled instruction. But the supervisor's expression turned unreadable as he read the line again. The sound? Aves asked. The man shook his head slowly. No one ever found what sound he meant. The second plate clicked open just as the sound echoed through the courtyard. It wasn't the clatter of boots or the grinding of cartwheels. No, it was something else entirely. A tone, low and pure, like the pluck of a single cello string held in the cold. Milo Penn froze, his gloved hands tightening around the coiled flash wire. He blinked once, twice, trying to find its source. But the mill yard remained empty. The old freight doors leaned shut, unmoving. The air, still and gray. Nothing had changed, yet the sound hung there, like it belonged to something waiting just out of sight. Edwin Crowthall slowly lifted his head from the viewfinder, his breath shallow, his lips slightly parted. You heard that? Milo asked, eyes darting across the stone yard. Edwin didn't respond right away. His fingers, red and chapped from the cold, hovered uncertainly above the shutter switch. A tremor passed through his hand like static. I did, he whispered finally. It's not wind. He stepped back from the camera, gaze locked on the courtyard bricks. A shiver ran down his spine, not from cold, but from a sudden sense that they were not alone. The courtyard, just moments ago dull and empty, now felt charged, as though the bricks had remembered something terrible and were holding it just beneath the surface. Milo glanced up at the sky. The overcast clouds had not moved. No shadows flickered, yet the silence now felt heavy, like a breath held too long. He took one cautious step closer to Edwin, who was now hunched again over the camera, hastily preparing the third plate. You sure you want to keep going? Edwin didn't answer. His movements were stiff now, jerky, as if he was working against some unseen pressure. He adjusted the tripod legs and set the third glass plate in place, but as he reached for the flash hood, his hand slipped. The black cloth hit the cobblestones with a dull slap. Milo startled. Edwin's hand clutched at his chest for a moment. His eyes, wide and fixed on the camera, seemed locked in some internal battle. I saw something, he murmured. Milo stepped to his side, peering into the viewfinder. There's nothing there. But Edwin didn't move. His eyes had gone glassy, his jaw tight. Then, in one slow motion, he released the shutter again. The flash erupted with a muted pop, yet in that instant, Milo felt it too. A vibration beneath his boots, like the ground had briefly quivered, though no sound followed. They stood in silence as the smoke cleared. Behind them, the mill's tall smokestack stood unlit. No steam rose. No workers stirred, just the hush of late afternoon in a courtyard that suddenly seemed too still to be real. It was only when they returned to the makeshift lab set up in the mill's unused storeroom that the full weight of what they'd captured began to settle in. The developing tray hissed faintly as Edwin lowered the second plate into the solution. Milo leaned over it, expecting the usual blur of bricks, soot, and shadows. But what emerged was wrong. The courtyard bricks were there, the old drain pipe, the soot-darkened archway. But beneath the central arch, a shape, a man's silhouette bent forward, hands clasped as if in prayer. No face, no coat, no figure casting it, just the shadow. Milo stepped back, mouth dry. There was no one there. "Edwin, we would have seen." "I know," Edwin replied, his voice nearly gone. His eyes never left the plate. He moved mechanically to prepare the third exposure. This time, as it slid into the tray, a faint smell lifted, sharp, metallic, tinged with something like ozone. Milo flinched at it. The chemical bath hadn't changed. Nothing should have smelled like that. The final plate revealed the same courtyard, the same outline. Only now the shadow had shifted, 2 feet to the west. It was identical in form, same bent posture, same clasped hands. But again, nothing above to explain it. "Edwin," Milo whispered, "what is this?" The older man didn't answer. He simply stepped back, rubbing his arms as if chilled to the bone. The next morning, the mill foreman arrived unannounced. Word had spread that something odd had turned up in the exposures. He demanded the plates. "They'll scare the workers," he barked. "Destroy them." Now, but Edwin refused. Quietly, without protest, he boxed the plates in straw and tucked them into his trunk, alongside old tripods, cracked lenses, and a copy of the Brimwell Courier from 1899. He left town within days, saying nothing more than that he'd accepted a quieter commission in New Hampshire. His assistant never saw him again. Years later, in 1936, a probate clerk inventorying Edwin's belongings found the trunk in an attic room, buried beneath moth-eaten coats and folded canvas. When they opened it, the room filled with a strange, sharp scent, like scorched pine needles after rain. Inside lay the 3 plates, unbroken, but slightly shifted in their sleeves. The clerk, a man named Joseph Loring, picked up the middle plate. "It's warm," he said aloud. The others in the room turned, but no one replied. Loring examined the image closely. He traced the edge of the shadow with a gloved finger, then pulled back suddenly as if burned. A silence fell. No one spoke of the image again, and the trunk was passed to the Brimwell County Archive. The label on the inventory sheet read only, "Crowthall Plates, 1902, handle with gloves." In pencil, at the bottom of the page, someone had scrawled a final note. The curator who touched the plates said they were warm. The first crackle came as a single snap across the filament of the overhead bulb. Professor Lionel Greer didn't look up yet. He was too focused on the fine crystalline striations beneath the Zeiss spectrograph. For over 2 hours, he had been adjusting the angle of the beam, recalibrating the focus, and comparing the fine silver halide patterns etched into the second glass plate from the Werrin negatives. But this was different. "Directionality," he murmured to himself, leaning closer. "They're pointing outward, not randomly, but outward." As if fleeing something beside him, his assistant, a quiet man named Clay Morvan, stiffened. "Like motion?" he asked, pencil pausing over the lab ledger. Greer nodded slowly. "Not ordinary motion. This grain alignment suggests motion from a non-luminous source." He said the words softly, but the air between them thickened the moment they left his mouth. Clay looked up, eyes wide, then underlined the phrase twice in the margins, his hand slightly trembling. Later that afternoon, Greer carried the plates across campus to Revan Polytechnic. The hallways were hushed, varnished floors creaking beneath his steps. In a dim laboratory on the 3rd floor, he met with Dr. Harland Eves, a tall man with a sallow face and eyes that blinked too little. "You brought it?" Eves asked, motioning toward the wooden case. Greer set the case down gently. "Plate 2. The anomaly Eves unlatched the brass clasps and studied the glass for only a few seconds before speaking again. "Do you see this, here?" He pointed to the faint discoloration near the lower edge. "That isn't a flaw. That's a lens rebound, but it's behaving backward. Density gradients like this are only found when light bends, unnaturally." Greer frowned. "Backward?" "As if the light struck something behind the plate and returned forward." Eves moved toward his own equipment. "Let's test it." He placed the glass beneath the density scanner, adjusted the light arc, and activated the charge calibrator. For the first few seconds, the lab was filled with the usual hum of low-voltage current and clicking dials. Then, all at once, the lights flickered. Not just dimmed, flickered, in a pattern, a long blink, then 2 short ones, then nothing. The room fell into silence, except for the low whir of the now fading calibrator coil. Both men stood still. "There's no wind," Eves whispered, glancing toward the sealed window. Greer stepped back. "Did the charge disrupt the current?" Eves shook his head slowly, then walked to the other end of the room, where he kept a secondary light source, an emergency sodium lamp. As he passed by the workbench, something caught his attention. The glass plate's reflection, visible in a chrome tool tray, was wrong. It didn't show the plate. It showed the outline again, blurred, but there. The curved back, the clasped hands, the silhouette of a man. No source, no body. Eves slowly turned back. "It's here." Greer, now visibly pale, stepped forward cautiously. "What do you mean?" But Eves didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the telegraph unit mounted on the far wall, ignoring the cold sweat trickling down his temple. He tapped out a short message with mechanical precision, each click echoing like a metronome of dread. 2. Greer, Brimwell. It followed my hand across the lens. The reply never came. That evening, Eves sat in his office, the room dim despite both desk lamps burning. He had sealed the plate in a lead-lined drawer and placed a warning label across it in red ink. No exposure. Motion record present. But as the hours passed, the sensation didn't fade. He had tried washing his hands, scrubbing them raw under hot water. Still, the feeling remained, the faint heat hovering just above his skin, like a current suspended in air. Every time he passed by the drawer, the sensation intensified, like standing too close to a static coil that never discharged. He tried to write it off, chalk it up to stress. But something inside him began to twist, a deep, primal resistance. He didn't sleep that night, nor the next. By the third morning, his resignation form sat neatly typed on his desk. It read, Name, Dr. Harland Eves position, Senior Research Physicist, date of resignation, June 10, 1940. Reason for departure. And that was where the form stopped. The line meant for the reason was left blank. No pen stroke, no explanation. Just the flickering absence of a cause. When the file reached the front office clerk for processing, he turned it over slowly, brows furrowed. Something about it unnerved him. Its silence, its hollowness. After a moment, he picked up a fountain pen and added a note to the margin in tidy, square handwriting. Departed without shadow. The lights in the basement archive flickered once, then held steady. Professor Lionel Greer stood at the center of the room, staring down at the glass plate resting on the matte black cloth. His breath fogged lightly in the stale air. The spectrograph had just cooled, its coils humming down with a reluctant whine, but the faint imprint on the screen still pulsed like a wound refusing to close. Across from him, Dr. Harland Eves adjusted the focus on the polarimeter and grunted. "You said this came from 1902? His voice was dry, clipped, like pages turning in a cold room. Greer nodded. 3 plates, taken seconds apart. The image appears in all three. No object casting the shadow. No fluctuation in natural light. Eves leaned in closer. The faint outline of a man, bent, hands clasped, blurred at the edges like smoke trapped in glass. "I'll admit," Eves said, wiping his glasses, "I've never seen mercury vapor behave like this." "It's not mercury," Greer replied, voice quiet but firm. "Silver halide grains, unburnt, crystallized, but in a formation I can't replicate." Outside the sealed chamber, the rest of the Revan Polytechnic Optics Wing was quiet. It was late, and the students had long gone home. Only Greer and Eves remained, two old men wrapped in their doubts and the haunting imprint of something that shouldn't be there. Greer pointed at the readout. Directionality. The crystals form as if they reacted to motion, but the source doesn't emit light. Eves hesitated. Then what did it emit? Greer didn't answer. He didn't need to. The humming started again, this time not from the machine, but from the air itself, thin, warbling, like a string bowed once and never stopped. Both men turned toward the vault door. "Don't move," Greer whispered. The temperature dropped, not sharply but with the slow, dreadful certainty of a draft in a sealed house. The air pressed in, and for a second Greer swore the shape on the plate had shifted. "It moved," Eves said. "You saw it too?" Greer asked. "I felt it." The lights flickered again. Eves stepped back from the spectrograph, palms slick with sweat. "We're not dealing with a visual artifact. This is reactive." Environmental Greer paced back, rubbing his temple. "I've had 5 theories so far. Everyone breaks the last, and the current one. A non-luminous motion source, like light bending around something." Greer hesitated. "Like it's still standing there, but on a delay." Eves snorted. "You're suggesting temporal distortion?" Greer didn't laugh. "I'm suggesting light arrived late." Eves exhaled and looked down again at the image. "This is either genius or madness." Neither spoke for a long while. Then Eves, without taking his eyes off the plate, said quietly, "It followed my hand across the lens." Greer looked up, startled. "When?" "Earlier." "I didn't want to say anything. I thought I was imagining it." "You're sure?" "I didn't imagine the burn mark," Eves muttered, pulling up his left sleeve. A narrow, pale line ran along his wrist like a thread of frostbite. Greer stared at it, unsettled. 2 days later, Eves resigned from the Polytechnic. His resignation form was neatly typed, name and date filled in, but the line marked "Cause" remained blank. The entry clerk, confused, scribbled a note in the margin for records. "Departed without shadow." A decade passed. By 1951, the procedural inquiry team from the State Industrial Archive took custody of the plate under the premise of evaluating historical hoaxes. Lead investigator Marcus Vellin, skeptical and well-read in photographic trickery, declared in the opening report, "This is likely a forgery by Edwin Crowthall to mask a fatal workplace accident." His logic was simple. Misdirect with a mystery, cover an incident, secure a payout. But payrolls from Werrin Mill told a different story. No deaths that week, no injuries, no claims. More disturbing, the shadow's posture, stooped, tall, thin, matched Crowthall himself. "Then who is he hiding?" Vellin asked aloud during the third session, flipping through the mill's ID records. No answer came. Even the science betrayed them. No emulsion failure could explain the tremors noted in the 1902 darkroom log. The assistant, Milo Penn, had scrawled, "Table shook once, no wind, felt through knees." So Vellin, too, resigned, though not formally. He simply stopped coming. His desk at the archive remained untouched for months, the coffee ring on his blotter still fresh when they finally cleared it out. By the early 1960s, the theories had grown stranger. The paranormal school had taken interest. Dr. Rafe Minden, theologian turned experimentalist, presented at the Brimwell Symposium in 1963 under the title Temporal Echoes and the Containment of Light. His paper proposed that the shadow was not a figure, but a moment. A looped sliver of time, he wrote, a person's outline delayed from the hour it belonged to. He demonstrated the chimney's angular alignment with solar transit at 4:12 p.m., down to the decimal. The light should have touched that wall, he said to the small crowd gathered in the university lecture hall. But it didn't. And yet, it recorded what had stood there, as if the light arrived years later and found him still waiting. A student asked from the back, "But wasn't it cloudy that day?" "Yes," Minden replied slowly. "Exactly." He left the stage in silence. Later that year, he published a second paper. It was retracted, and so the theories began to fold in on themselves, each one a promise, then a disappointment. Scientific logic failed to replicate the exposure. Mechanical analysis proved inconclusive. Supernatural frameworks stretched thin under their own weight. Theories were no longer explanations. They were mirrors, each one showing a different fear, each one asking the same question. What casts a shadow when there is no object to cast it? Even now, decades later, the image defies all consensus. For every researcher who claims illusion, another whispers intent. A reflection? A death? A memory? Or a warning? Only one line appears across every ledger, every report, every journal. The shadow endures because it refuses to mean one thing. The first alarm rang out at 3:17 a.m. Walter Hines had just finished his second cup of black coffee, his back stiff from sitting in the monitoring chair too long. The Brimwell County Historical Annex was always quiet at that hour, more tomb than archive, but the sudden shrill of the humidity sensor made his spine jolt upright. The red light blinked steadily, marked Vault 3B, Deep Archive. "That's sealed," he muttered aloud, reaching for his keyring with a frown etched deep into his brow. He grabbed his flashlight and moved through the chilled corridor, his boots echoing against the linoleum. The further he walked, the thicker the air felt. Not warm, but heavy, like walking through a breath someone had just exhaled. When he reached the steel-reinforced door of Vault 3B, he paused. Moisture streamed down the keypad, though the temperature outside was well below freezing. That made no sense. Walter punched in the code. The latch clunked, the mechanism slower than usual, as if something inside resisted the opening. When the vault door creaked outward, a wave of cold, metallic air swept over him. It hit his skin like a breath of coins. Inside, the overhead fluorescent light buzzed once, then flickered erratically. There were 49 sealed artifact cases in the vault, each kept at a regulated climate, untouched for decades. But only one, Case 17B, tagged Werrin Mill, 1902 plates, was beaded with condensation. The rest remained dry, their glass lids clean and clear. Walter approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight catching strange patterns on the surface of the fogged glass. He wiped the sleeve of his sweater across it. Beneath the smear, the plates had shifted, just slightly. Each one had slid perhaps half an inch from its metal mount, though the seals on the case remained visibly intact. "That's not possible," he whispered, peering down with growing unease. Then the light above him dimmed, once, then again. And in the split second of near darkness, something moved. It wasn't on the glass, but behind it. Walter staggered backward. His breath caught in his throat. On the rear wall of the vault, just opposite the case, a shadow had formed. It was unmistakable, a silhouette of a man, stooped forward, hands clasped. The same shape he'd seen in the old research files, the ones he had once laughed off as over-imaginative archivist notes. His mouth moved to speak, but no sound came. The flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam narrowing to a single dim point. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. The shadow didn't shift or flicker like a projection. It stood, present, still. a figure rendered in nothing but absence. Walter turned to run, but stopped himself. "No, just look again. Just confirm," he whispered, trying to ground his rising panic. He stepped forward, but the temperature dropped again, this time sharp. Frost bloomed across the outer edges of the case. Then came the sound, a faint, low-pitched hum, like a cello string being dragged slowly by a broken bow. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The floor beneath him vibrated, not shaking, but pulsing, in time with something he couldn't name. The lights gave one last sputter and steadied again. And the shadow was gone. Walter stood frozen, sweat clinging to his forehead despite the cold. He couldn't be sure if the figure had moved or if it had simply ceased to exist. He took one slow step back, then another, and finally fled, leaving the vault door hanging wide. By 3:36 a.m., pressure monitors in the facility logged a sudden drop lasting exactly 11 seconds. The anomaly was never explained. Maintenance reports from that morning noted no breaches, no equipment failure, no waterline damage. The only record of what happened came from Walter's own report, hastily typed at 4:02 a.m., his hands still shaking. He ended it with a single sentence: "I will not go back in." Following his report, the vault was permanently sealed. An order was issued by the Brimwell Board of Preservation to rebox the plates in triple-wrapped lead sleeves, labeled with a bold stencil across the front: "Do not photograph again." Years passed. The vault remained undisturbed until 2009. Somehow, somewhere in the chain of digitization during the Institute's modernization project, a high-resolution scan of Plate 2 appeared on an amateur history forum. The thread was labeled innocently, "Old Mill Plates, any historians here?" For 3 hours the image circulated freely, gathering a few comments about the strange brickwork, the curve in the ground, the way the exposure seemed too modern. Then the thread vanished. Users who attempted to revisit the page were met with a blank redirect. One user, a photography student from Vermont, claimed he had downloaded the image before the takedown and attempted to enhance it. At frame 27 of the enhancement playback, he noticed a strange warping in the brick pattern, a soft curve around an empty space, like heat bending the air above asphalt. "I'm telling you, it's like the ground knows something is standing there," he posted, "like it's making room for it." The account was deleted a day later. The scan has never resurfaced. The plates remain locked away beneath layers of vault steel and silence. The shadow, whether echo, fraud, or intent, was never photographed again. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.